Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour for 2023. We're back after a 2-week break. We're ahead the best of series for the last 2 weeks, and my guest tonight is Dan Donovan. He is the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. We've had the chance, the opportunity to have Dan on the show a few times before. We thought this would be a great way to start the 2023 year with Dan talking a little bit about what's going on in Ottawa in our political life. The emergency measures inquiry is something that Dan and I have talked about in the past. I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk a little bit about where the government's going. Bill Morneau has talked a little bit about his book. I think it's coming out this week or next. And Jordan Peterson is something else that Dan wants to talk about. So Dan, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brian, Happy New Year, and Happy New Year to all your listeners.
Thank you very much, and welcome back. And tell me, what do you think is going to happen with this emergency measures inquiry? Sometime soon, the judgment's going to come out. Tell us a little bit about what you think the judge is going to say.
Well, I would say that for any university students or anyone who's interested in public policy, if you want to get some insight into the sausage-making machine that is government, it is worthwhile reviewing or indeed watching some of the testimony that came out at this Emergencies Act inquiry that was overseen. It was led by Judge Paul Rouleau in Ottawa. It is shocking. I think that anybody that watched any part of it should be very concerned about our democracy in Canada. I think that what it showcased is, in many ways, is something I've actually observed and written about for many years, but to see it sort of live is really shocking. You see testimony by some senior officials in this country who are unelected, who are civil servants, who are highly paid. Many of them graduated from the Peter Principal School. They've risen to their complete level of incompetency. But to see it laying out bare in their testimony, to see their crass mass incompetence of these people who are not paid. I'm not talking like being paid 180 grand or 200 grand. Some of these people are paid, $380,000, $400,000 plus a year, plus expenses. They have drivers. It is really the nomenclature, if you will, of the elite group of government in Canada, and their behavior and their testimony at this inquiry should shock people to the core. And in particular, there were a couple of people. Now, remember, the inquiry was put forward by the government really to try to contain the outrage by a lot of people, including the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, at the invocation of the Emergencies Measures Act.
Well, it's an obligation of that act to have such an inquiry, is it not, after the fact?
Well, technically, yes. But of course, the act was invoked. They didn't follow the rules in invoking the act. The government tried to suppress an inquiry initially. But I think they were forced, literally, and then they tried to just have like a sort of a parliamentary look into it. But there was so much pressure on them because of invoking this act that they had to have the inquiry. The troubling aspect of it was that in the testimony, it became very clear just what happened here. And essentially, the government was saying that if they had not invoked this act, they couldn't have shut down these protests. It appears that the testimony, if you look at the collective amount of testimony that's come out to date, and Mr. Rouleau has to report in February on with the results in this, it becomes very clear that on the one hand, that the EMA was a massive overreach. And remember, this is the closest thing we have in this country to martial law. But the question for the commission was it reasonable? Was it reasonable for the government, given the circumstances at the time? Was it reasonable? Was it not unreasonable for the government to take this measure? That's the issue. And I actually think at the end of this, the the Judge Rouleau, is going to come out. I could be proven wrong, and it'd be interesting to talk to you in a month. I think he's probably going to come out and say, given the circumstances at the time, it was not unreasonable for the government to invoke this act. So that's probably what's going to happen. But there's a caveat to that. And the caveat is that there was such crass incompetence at multiple levels of government that is actually, at the end of this, quite reasonable for the judge to say, given the absolute incompetence across multiple government systems, the idea that they would do this is not unreasonable, because they basically were incompetent in every other element of what they were doing. So I think it's a bit of a contradiction, but I think that's actually what's going to happen. You're going to see a lot of,
because of incompetence, you could do something that was overreach.
Yeah, because of the incompetence, a reasonable person would say, well, it's putting in that act, given the complete disarray at all levels of government, that's not unreasonable.
Now, I had seen in my media reading, incompetence in the police force and the police commission and the police, the chief of police. I saw sort of jurisdictional disputes between Ontario and Ottawa, but I hadn't seen this incompetence at senior levels of the civil service. Tell us a little bit more about that, if you could.
Well, I think I can state that by example. I think if your listeners are interested, they should go to YouTube and pull up the hearing. And there are two people who testified in particular that I found three really shocking. One was this Deputy Minister, Jody Thomas, and I think she represented more than anyone when you get arrogance and dismissiveness by officials in government. She was so petulant towards the lawyers at the commission and so snotty and full of herself. And this is it's quite shocking, because she's a senior member and she was the key person who, despite being presented with evidence that clearly showed that this was an overreach, she just dismissed it all and just decided, well, we're going to do this. And really, to understand the nature of this, you have to watch her testimony, where she's just so petulant. And this is a public servant, someone who's supposed to be obeying the laws of this country. It clearly came out in the testimony between her and David Vigneault, who is the director of CSIS, that according to the legislation and the laws, they did not have all of the things in place to recommend invoking the Emergency Measures Act. Clearly, as officials, this did not meet the standard. That became very clear in the testimony. But both her and Vigneault said, so what? And it was almost like, we don't have to obey the law. We don't have to obey the legislation. What's shocking about this director of CSIS, and I think he actually should resign. It's so shocking what he said. He admitted they did not have the authority under the legislation to do this, but he said, so even though we didn't have that, I didn't recommend that we do this in my role as CSIS director. I recommended we do it in my other role as national security director. It's just these mind games. Oh, I know. I saw you wince, right? I winced. And you thought, who are these people? Are they just making this stuff up as they go? But it goes to the issue of the governance in this country, the abject powers that senior civil servants have and seem to give themselves, and they're in this bubble. And then they think that they're sort of tone with officials and with MPs and their dismissiveness of Parliament. It's just shockingly dangerous. So I think that that was something that people really noticed at the commission. Then you had another case where you had a local counselor here she's not a counselor anymore. This is Catherine McKenney, and she was at the time running for mayor, and she was caught on a hot mic at a federal commission trying to telling another counselor, because they had a certain, when you go to a federal inquiry, you should just testify as to what the facts are or what you experienced. That's all you're asked to do. Get in front of a commission and tell the truth. But this counselor who I said who ran for mayor and thankfully lost in Ottawa, Catherine McKenney, she and her and another colleague, Matthew Fleury, who's a former counselor from Lower Town, they got before the commission, and their whole thing was they didn't want to just sort of tell what happened or tell the truth. What they decided to do was they had a narrative they wanted to bring to the commission, and it had to be their narrative. So they were just saying things like they experienced violence, so they during this period. So one of the commission lawyers, and I'm paraphrasing all this, basically said, "Well, can you be specific about what kind of violence you're talking about?" And this guy goes, "Well, we saw the trucks; they were the same as tanks." I mean, how ridiculous! I mean, let's not even pivot off to the war in Ukraine and the tragedy that's going on over there. But you see the mindset of some of these people. So one of the lawyers said to this guy, well, what do you mean? What particular violence did you experience? And then Catherine McKenney was caught on a hot mic right next to him, whispering to this guy, answer in French because he doesn't understand French.
Oh my
Trying
God.
to deliberately mislead the commission. She got caught. And that basically demolished her run for mayor in Ottawa. She was starting to lose ground to Mark Sutcliffe, who eventually won the race. But after that, she just tanked. So there were so many things at this commission. A lot of manipulation. You had Peter Slowly, I think.
No, I got to interrupt. We got to take a message
Sure.
because I really want to focus in on the police and what happened there, because I know it's something that we've spoken about before and you're passionate about, but it's going to take longer than we've got before the next message. So we're going to take a break for some messages. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with Dan Donovan, the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. We're talking right now about the emergency measures inquiry. We're going to talk about the state of Canadian politics and some other stuff. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're back in 2023. Our guest tonight is Dan Donovan. He's the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine, and we're talking about the emergency measures inquiry that's been happening in December in Ottawa. Dan followed it fairly closely. We're going to talk about the political situation in Canada as well, but Dan, you were just about to talk about the former chief of police. And, I did watch some of the inquiry, and I was frankly aghast, not at the incompetence that you were talking about. Maybe I didn't watch it closely enough, but what appeared to me to be incompetence with the Ottawa police. Tell me about your perception.
Well, it's shocking. And I'm going to preface my remarks by saying that 8 months prior to the whole convoy protest last year, the former police chief in Ottawa, Peter Slowly, sued our magazine for defamation. It's a spurious, frivolous lawsuit. It's a slap lawsuit, a strategic lawsuit against public participation, because he's a bully. And he didn't like, we were reporting prior to this whole trucker convoy in Ottawa about the misogyny and sexism and police misconduct. We've talked about this before on your show, Brian, at the Ottawa Police Service, which is just a whole other level of incompetence. And we'd been writing for some time about the Ottawa Police Services Board and their lack of oversight, and that their lack of oversight was contributing to further police misconduct in Ottawa. So Peter Slowly, at the time, he didn't like what we were writing, so he threatened our magazine, and he demanded that he sent us a demand letter from these lawyer people, and demanding that we withdraw an article called "Rapes and Lies: The Cancerous Misconduct of the Ottawa Police Service" that outlined a number of rapes and sexual assaults and other egregious things that Ottawa police members had been part of. And I mentioned to you once before, we had over 80 Ottawa police officers over 6 years who were criminally charged. Not one of them was fired. Several of them were suspended for 3 and 4 years and made $500,000 and $600,000 in salary. So anyways, we wrote about this. But Slowly's a bully. So he demanded that we remove this article from our website. Everything in it was true. And then he threatened a defamation suit against us. So I like to say, we were the canary in the coal mine with this guy and with the Ottawa Police Services Board. And if you'll pardon the expression, the complete manure show of that service came to was spread evenly across the country by this department during this trucker convoy. And it's shocking. One thing that most people when Slowly appeared at the commission, it's interesting, whether you were on the with the group of people who were, with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, or some of these people in the trucker thing, or some of the protesters, or even if you were on the government side, the one thing that everyone seemed to agree on at this commission was that Peter Slowly was incompetent. That his testimony basically showed that he let the trucks in. He was told hey, one thing Ottawa's been doing for like over 150 years since Confederation, guess what it is? Protests. Okay, we've had thousands of them. People in Ottawa in policing, and there's 6 police services in Ottawa between the RCMP, the Parliamentary Security, the OPP, the Ottawa Police, private police services. One thing we've been doing since Confederation is managing protests. But what became very clear in the testimony was that Mr. Slowly made a decision to let the trucks into Ottawa. And I've maintained from the beginning, he was involved in that shit show in Toronto back in 2012 in the G20, when all of those people were kettled and arrested in Toronto. And, so he just was not listening to the intelligence. He was not listening to the other police services. And then, as we know, it came out during the testimony that at one point, when this was getting really quite serious, the third weekend, he told Diane Deans, that another incompetent person who was the chair of the Ottawa Police Services Board and lacks oxygen, okay, he told her that, well, cut me a check and I'm out of here. Cut me a check and I'm out of here. How's that for your policing and civil service and dutiful officer? Cut me a check and I'm out of here. Because he was just, I called it, I wrote an article on this called the Peter Principle. And again, that's where you rise to the level of your incompetency. And they've tried, they've tried to make this about other things, but it's really not. It's about competency. And it was shocking when it seemed the only adult in the room on the policing side were the OPP deputy commissioner. They came in and they said, look, we can do this. We can clear this out with existing resources, but we need a plan. And slowly, at one point he said he doesn't have enough resources. At one point he's getting all weepy-eyed. I mean, it's pathetic. And then he says, they said, well, what do you need? And he says, well, I need 1,600 police. Well, do you know how many police the Ottawa Police Service has, Brian? 1,600. So he's saying, to resolve this, I need yet a whole other police department. And I mean, it's just bizarre. And then the OPP said, well, what's your plan? And he didn't seem to have a plan. And in the middle of this, besides not communicating to people in the city, Peter Slowly hired a firm in Toronto called Navigator, a public relations firm, and paid them like 150 grand to help him communicate. I mean, and this is coming from a police chief who just months earlier was talking about how he doesn't have enough budget. So the whole thing came out at the commission, and it really, at the end of the day, came down to police incompetency of the Ottawa Police Service. I mean, had he not let the trucks in, none of this would have happened. But then you have other testimony from the Justice Minister, who basically got up and lied to the commission.
Lied.
Oh yeah, normally you would say allegedly lied. No, the fact showed he lied. He misled people, deliberately misled people. That came out very clearly at the commission. The Prime Minister.
Sorry. How did he lie?
Well, he when you start rolling back the timeline into the steps he took to invoke the Emergency Measures Act, he was claiming that there were discussions that were had between him and officials that never occurred. And it was proven at the commission, things he said occurred just didn't occur. And he was making stuff up. So it became very apparent that he had an agenda he was following. And he was suggesting, like, one of the things he said is that the police advised the government to invoke the EMA. That's a blatant lie. They didn't. There was and multiple police testified saying, no, we did not. The only people that recommended the EMA were the CSIS director, after he acknowledged he didn't have the legislative authority to do it. So he didn't do it as a CSIS director, he did it as national security advisor. And this other bureaucrat, Jody Thomas, who the arrogant person I was talking about, who also just didn't care that she wasn't following legislation. Just
You
said,
said
well,
she was deputy minister. What was her position?
Well, she's a former deputy minister at DND, and then she was the deputy minister and security advisor to the prime minister, and appears from the testimony at the commission to be one of the key people he was listening to. But then again, we have to be, we're always careful. We say allegedly lied if or allegedly misspoke when we're talking about public officials or anyone. But the prime minister lied at the commission. I'm not going to, people in the legacy media are going, oh, he had a great day, he gave great testimony, but he lied. He said that he was asked specifically if he gaslighted these people and if he called them racist and white supremacists, and he said he didn't do that. And while he's testifying, they're showing, on different sites, they're showing him doing exactly that last February. So, but even with all of that, at the end of the day, even with this is a mass abusive process, but at the end of the day, the judge is in a certain lane. So some people are I think he's going to come out and say it's not unreasonable for the government to do this, given the situation at the time. And I think that's, as much as I hate to say it, I think it's true. I mean, if the Ottawa police are telling the government to be fair to the government, I mean, despite all of their lying and their arrogance and all of this, to be fair to them for a moment, okay? If you're the prime minister or the justice minister or the public security minister, and I'm sorry, Mendicino's he's not the justice minister. He was the public security minister during all of this. Okay, so but the point is this: if you're these people and you have the parliamentary district shut down, and you have the protests that we had that were really dramatically impacted the local residents of Ottawa, and you have an Ottawa police chief who's telling you, well, we're going to take care of this, we're going to take care of this. And then you have other officials telling them, we're going to take care of it, we're going to take care of it. And then you're into the second and third week and it's not being taken care of. You're going to get upset and you're going to say, well, what are you doing? What are you doing to fix this? And I think at the end of the day, they were just so frustrated with it. Really, it was almost like a Hail Mary pass. They said, let's put in the EMA because we got to stop this. Now, interesting, in the period when they invoked the EMA, just prior to that, slowly resigned. And when competent police took over, as soon as slowly left, within 3 days, the competent police came in and this thing was over. And all of those police said, we didn't need the EMA. We had a plan. We have a plan. We can take care of this. So this is the challenge. It's really about competency in government. But of course, this is the theme in this government since Trudeau's been elected. We've seen the competency issue in so many other areas, Brian. We've seen competency issues just during the Christmas vacation when it comes to the federal regulator and the airlines. The airports aren't working. A luggage rack at Toronto Pearson breaks down one of the luggage racks that clear suitcases, and then it backs up the entire friggin' country for weeks because we have an incompetent transport minister who can't seem to get the luggage out. This is a federally regulated authority, the airport authority, and tens of thousands of people were impacted by this. So we have a competency issue in immigration. This government says they want to bring in up to 500,000 immigrants a year over the next couple of years. So we have 1.3 million immigrants backlogged in the system right now. How can you bring in more people when you can't even process the people you have coming in? And a lot of those immigrants coming to Canada are getting so frustrated when they get here, they can't get their credentials recognized. They're put in this milk line for years where they can't get on with their lives because of bureaucracy. So it's mismanagement. I mean, the passport offices, during COVID, the Trudeau government, which by the way, has increased the civil service by 60,000 positions since they got in. 60,000 positions during COVID. They allowed civil servants to work from home. They paid for all of their equipment and technology and computers to work from home. That's another big scandal coming. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent to equip public servants to work from home. They moved people out of their offices in disarray. Then they shut down these offices. They had public servants working from home. And for example, just in the passport side of the office, public servants were given $1.4 billion in wage increases and bonuses during COVID. Well, hundreds of thousands of Canadians are suffering and businesses are closing. And just on the passport office side, they couldn't get passports out last year. You think, well, what were these people doing when they were working from home? Why can't we get our passports out? There's no increase in the capacity in the hospitals in this country at all. They spent $1 trillion in COVID. Now, the big problem in Ottawa these days is public servants and the unions don't want to go back to work. They want the right, they feel it's their right now to work from home, that they shouldn't have to go into the office. That's a whole other debate here in Ottawa. But, so certain people are saying, listen, the passports offices aren't working. The airports aren't working. The healthcare system isn't working. The procurement system isn't working. The tax system isn't working. They gave out $4.8 billion in overpayments to unqualified people during COVID. None of these things are working. And you don't want to go back to work. You don't want to go back to the office. You feel it's your right to work from home. You're amongst the highest paid people in the country. So I think that these are all issues that are sort of coming to a head in 2023. And I think I'm sensing with a lot of people a real frustration with the very competency of government. And the commission laid that bare. It's shocking to see the incompetence of people who are supposed to be managing things for our country.
That's an unbelievable soliloquy that you've given us on what you read from the commission inquiry and how you think it extends through numerous different parts of our government. I don't think that came out in the media nearly to the degree that you described.
Can I make a point? I'll make a point, Brian, and I apologize to your listeners and everyone if I seem to be it's almost like I'm giving some kind of a soliloquy here on a ranting, but I am ranting a bit because I just find it so incredible. Like, we had just before Christmas, Mary Ng, the trade minister, another person who should join the chapter of the Peter Principle, a person who rises to the level of their incompetency. She was found in breach, that means guilty, by the ethics commissioner of violating the ethics rules as a minister because she gave out a $25,000 plus contract to her friend. So the ethics commissioner said, you can't do that. Now, her friend is a regular contributor on CBC's political show Power and Politics, which is basically a propaganda arm for any press release the Trudeau government puts out. The CBC gets $1.4 billion a year, and now you have the Rosemary Barton and these other people that go on these shows who have been so discredited for being cheerleaders for the Trudeau government for so long. That's why their ratings are in the toilet. But the point is this: they have guests on, like the person who was given the money by her friend marrying the minister, who then get on their show on the state broadcaster and sing the praises of the government. But the people watching this don't know, well, she's doing that because her friend Mary Ng has just given her a $25,000 contract. You can assume, I've never heard this person on this show say anything critical of the government. So it's really quite disturbing that this web that they've woven, and it's all it's just all kind of icky, and I find it really distasteful. And the irony's not lost on me that just yesterday or 2 days ago in Ontario, the College of Psychologists, here's a bag of jelly beans. These College of Psychologists, okay, they threaten Jordan Peterson.
Okay, hold it. Another topic. We're going to take a break and come back with this topic because I think this is another interesting one. I got it. Before we cut for a message, though, Dan. I think incompetence, certainly within the police services board and the police department in Ottawa, came out very strongly at the inquiry, at least from what I read and what I watched. Disputes, we haven't talked about this, disputes between Ontario, the government of Ontario and the federal government, and sort of the blame game back and forth came out. But I don't think the incompetence that you described came out, or at least wasn't talked about by the media that I read nearly as much as what you're describing. So we're going to have to delve into that more and understand that. I do think that this whole sausage making of politics did come out, that it was kind of messy and really the reality of some of the text messages back and forth and the emails back and forth and the conversations back and forth that were detailed, I think were really quite illustrative of how sausages are made, how politics is and policies are decided. But the incompetence is interesting, and I think that goes to some of the comments that I was mentioning. Just been recently reported that Bill Barneau, the former Minister of Finance, has talked about. And so let's come back to that. But we're going to take a break and come back with your comments about Jordan Peterson, because I think this is another really interesting topic. Stay with us, everyone. We're going to be back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Dan Donovan. He's the editor and publisher of Ottawa Life magazine. We've had a really interesting, spirited conversation about the war measures, emergency measures inquiry, and incompetence. Freudian slip on the war measures. I apologize. And you were just about to launch into a conversation about Jordan Peterson, and I'm not sure if everyone is aware of this. So take a step back, please, and tell us who Jordan Peterson is and what this controversy is.
Well, Jordan Peterson is probably the most famous public intellectual in the world right now. He has been for the last 5 or 6 years, a Canadian. He was a tenured professor at the University of Toronto. He's written several best-selling books, Rules for Life, this type of thing. He was a clinical psychologist for 3 decades, had literally hundreds and hundreds of patients, was a professor at really outside of his profession, a sort of a nondescript, non-known professor until about 6 years ago, when the whole woke movement started in Toronto, and the pronoun issue. Remember all of that? What's your pronoun? So Peterson did some public debates and was on guest shows initially in Canada, where he was saying, he was talking about compelled speech and this idea that you should treat people respectfully and speak to them as they wish to be spoken to, but you can't compel people to use certain language. He made the case, and a lot of people support this, and I support it certainly, that you cannot compel people to tell them how they need to speak. We have free speech laws in this country. We're a democracy, and it's very Orwellian to have people say to you that you need to use certain pronouns when you're speaking to people. That's an individual choice. But he always couched everything he says in about being respectful. But there was this, so he became massively popular as a public intellectual. And one of his most famous discussions early on was when he was on the BBC with this journalist, and he basically hoisted her by her own petard, and just she was trying to bait him, and he basically caught her in a contradiction. And that video has been seen multi-millions of times, and it really led to his global fame. So he's appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast and other podcasts, and he's made comments. And, as you will see today in the Twitterverse, which I call the idiot verse. But anyways, people are easily offended. Everybody's offended by something today, right? So there are people who make complaints because they didn't agree with his opinion, which is fine. We can agree to disagree agreeably. You can disagree with people. But what happened is the College of Psychologists of Ontario, which is an oversight body that's a government regulated and mandated body that looks after the College of Psychologists. Look, it's like the College of Physicians and Surgeons for psychologists. They set standards. They're involved in the licensing of psychologists and so forth. Well, these wokists, I guess, on this board decided. I'm sure I went and looked at who the members are in their board. So when I started looking at these people, it became very evident to me why this happened. They're either jealous of Jordan Peterson's profile, or they didn't like some of the things he was saying. Like he said, one of the things that apparently he said that was harmful was that he took issue with the whole idea of sex changes for young kids, and he's made comments about that he thinks that's wrong. He's made comments about this actress Ellen Page in Juno, that he made a comment about her that she had this sex change. He didn't think that was a good idea. Like, nothing, it's an opinion. He made comments about there was a very obese woman who was put on the cover of a fashion magazine, and he made the comment, that's not healthy, that's not pretty, it never will be, just because you're mandating that it is. And he was making the point, this is not a healthy thing to promote obesity. So he said things that people can agree or disagree with, but they're certainly not hateful, and they're certainly not something that should be suppressed. But anyways, this College of Psychologists mandated to him in a letter that they were investigating him, and that he had to take social media training. Imagine, this guy has probably more social media experience and followers than anyone else in Canada and in many Western countries. And this Government of Ontario mandated group told him that under the threat that he could lose his license, that he needs to be retrained. So I took a look at the board of these people, and you look at their background. A lot of them are from the woke clubs at the universities in this country. You think they're in violation of their professional duties as board members and doing oversight, because what they're doing is threatening his livelihood. Now, not his, because he's now like a multimillionaire because of his public fame and his books and so forth, but it's the precedent they would be setting, because they're basically saying, if you don't speak in a way politically and with opinions that we agree with, we're going to remove your license. That's basically what they're saying to him. We don't agree with your politics, so we're going to take away your livelihood. And it's so objectionable and such an overreach. So what he decided to do this week was, instead of listening to these boneheads, he sued them. He's taken them to court. And it's going to be a very important public case and precedent case in this country, because I believe what they've done is a complete abuse of authority. And it shows the problem we have in this country with people getting confused with their feelings and their political thoughts versus what the laws are and what people's rights are in terms of expressing their opinion. So it's very troubling. Now, at some point, the Ford government should be doing something. In my opinion, they should be doing something about this and having a review of this board. But I'm not hopeful that even the Doug Ford Conservative government will do that, because they acted in a very cowardly way and didn't even show up for the commission in Ottawa. They went to court. Premier Ford went to court to fight, and they actually won in court, that he did not have to appear before the Rouleau Commission on the truckers thing, the EMA Act in Ottawa, even though he was a big part of it. So again, it just shows you the dysfunction in our system. How even Doug Ford was a big part of that EMA program being implemented. Trudeau and his
supported
cabinet,
Trudeau, and said he came out publicly saying he supported the institution of the emergency measures.
He did, and then so I'm thinking, well,
and I think a lot of people would say that he abdicated responsibility for what was going on in Ottawa.
I agree, and it's so look. Sometimes it's easy. Believe me, it's a low-hanging fruit to criticize the Trudeau government. There's a low gene pool there. But the point is, in Toronto, Doug Ford, they did the same thing. They just shirked their responsibility, and it's very troubling. And I'm hoping that they don't shirk their responsibility on this thing. That's this thing that they've done to Jordan Peterson. There's a big problem today in our government. What I see happening is stuff from university now, from these sort of ideologues in university, has seeped into the government, and it's now infecting our civil service in terms of the service delivery that we're getting. I mean, I may have spoken to you just by way of example, Brian, about this fellow Leif Maruth, who is who was given a couple of contracts by the Trudeau government, totaling almost $1 million. And this guy he was given this money by Canadian Heritage to advise publishers and other people in media on diversity. Okay. This happened in August. This guy is a rabid anti-Semite. He's called Jewish people dogs. He's called for them to be killed. You can Google this guy and find all of this stuff. Yet even though all of that is readily available with a Google search, the Department of Canadian Heritage gave this guy a $490,000 contract to advise other people in media on diversity, because they're anti-Semites, they're anti-Jewish people. And this is right in our government now. So this came out in the House of Commons in August, and it was learned that the minister knew about this for a month and he did nothing. But the point is this: when you apply to federal programs for funding, there are civil servants, and they have to vet things and make decisions on who gets the funds and who doesn't. So the question I raised, and that was raised in the House of Commons by many MPs, was, how is it that you can have public servants in the Department of Canadian Heritage who have the background documentation on this guy, who's a rabid anti-Semite, who has called for the killing of Jewish people, and these very same officials, even having that information, can go ahead and give $500,000 in Canadian taxpayer money to this guy? How does that happen?
What's the answer?
It's competency. It goes to my point that there's mass incompetency in the government right now, and we're getting people. This Trudeau government's been very focused on this equality and diversity agenda, identity politics. Everything today is about, in Ottawa, it's not about getting the job done. It's not about competency. It's not about budget. It's about, what is this color of your skin? What is your religion? What is your identity? And that's how you get a job in Ottawa. You have to meet certain conditions of identity. So while they're so obsessed with all of this stuff, which is very corrosive on many levels, it's not to say that there shouldn't be fairness and diversity, but there's also got to be merit. They put the merit thing aside, and everything is based on identity politics. Now, it even came out yesterday, just as in yet another example, we can't seem to build things in this country. The Canadian forces are massively underfunded. They can't get any procurement. They don't have equipment. Some of the soldiers are buying stuff online from the States for their own uniforms. Okay. We have a multi-gazillion dollar shipbuilding contract in New Brunswick with the Irving Corporation. Okay. It's tripled in a decade. We're talking, it was supposed to be initially like $30 billion. It's now well over $100 billion. It came out yesterday that to build two ships, okay, two ships, the cost has gone from like $400 million to $1.6 billion. Now, Brian, you were in business, okay? Like, hello, I was in business. Hello. How does that happen? It's because we have people who are in charge of the taxpayers' money that are massively incompetent. And I'm telling you, a reckoning is coming, and this country is now $1 trillion in debt. The Trudeau government has spent more money in the last 7 years than all Canadian governments combined since Confederation. We have $1 trillion debt. We have a housing crisis in this country. Young people, my kids, your kids, you can't afford to get into the housing market in this country anymore. We have mass inflation. We have more people visiting food banks than we've had in 5 decades. We have no controls over our financial systems. I mean, you mentioned Bill Morneau's book. Morneau, he basically is coming out and basically saying, yeah, basically the problem here is that these people, they don't have the skills to do what we need done in government. That's basically what his book says.
No, I haven't read the book, but the article that I read describing it says that he thought that the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was excellent at charisma and publicity, but wasn't competent, didn't know how to communicate with people, wasn't a good manager of people.
Well, at the end of the day, Canadians are going to have to make a decision about whether or not they want, they want someone who's an actor or who's some kind of jester, or do they want competency? And checkbook items always seem to be important. It was very fashionable. Unfortunately, we don't have outside past Ontario. This government has no support in the West. They've got a few seats in BC, but they basically don't have any legitimacy in terms of governing in Western Canada, and this government is being propped up by the NDP, which is all in the Toronto sort of Ontario.
But then
region.
Morneau came out extremely critical, I understand, of Poilievre as well, and said that he just has a blood sport attitude toward Parliament and didn't have constructive ideas, just wanted to win arguments and see how many people he could decimate on the floor of Parliament of the House of Commons.
Well, I think there's, I guess what I would observe on that is I understand Morneau saying that because Pierre Poilievre skewered him in the House. There's no doubt that Mr. Poilievre is probably, and I don't think you could agree, most parties would say this, he's one of the most effective MPs in terms of his oratory skills in the House and debaters. There's no doubt about it. And he skewered Bill Morneau. Let's not forget that Mr. Morneau, who's a very wealthy Canadian, no problem, like good for you, right? But somehow decided to charge $40,000 to taxpayers for his trip to Africa for his family. So and this was, of course, during the We Charity scandal when Mr. Morneau and others in the Trudeau cabinet tried to sole source, I'm not making this up, man, sole source a $950 million contract to their friends at the We Charity. And again, the We Charity paid for Mr. Morneau and his family to travel to Africa. So I can understand why Bill Morneau's got it in for Pierre Poilievre. But the fact is that Mr. Poilievre has put forward, since he's won the leadership, I think some very effective policies for Canada. I'll give you this. I mean, I would be surprised if even Bill Morneau would disagree with this. Last summer, the German chancellor came to Canada, okay? And he said, the war in Ukraine, Germany had tethered itself to the Russian natural gas. Europe has an energy crisis now. They need energy. And they shut down all their nuclear plants. They want to get off fossil fuels. So now energy in Europe is through the ceiling because of the Russian war in Ukraine. The German chancellor comes to Canada and he says, yeah, listen, all of you, okay, I want to buy all of your energy, all of it, gas, LNG, fossil fuel, electric. I will buy everything, all of it, everything you have. Now, you're in business. I'm in business, okay? That's somebody saying, I want to buy everything you have. So what's our prime minister's response to that?
There's not a business case.
I don't think you have a good business case. So you know what the Germans did? They went to Australia, which is 3 times as far away for them as Canada. And 3 months later, they announced an $80 billion energy package to buy energy from Australia. $80 billion. That's the problem with this government. They don't understand business. And on top of that, the telecoms. Remember last year, the telecoms went down for a couple of days. Rogers went down. Businesses across this country couldn't get on the internet, including our business. The government said they're going to do something about this after. And what did they do? Nothing. We pay the highest mobile cell phone rates in the world, and they just agreed to allow the Telus Shaw merger to go ahead. We've got monopolies in this country in telecoms. We've got monopolies in energy. The banks are an oligopoly. The airlines are a monopoly. The grocery store business is a monopoly. It came out this week, inflation, people at food banks, and some people go to Loblaws to buy some chicken. It costs $40 for chicken breast. And where's our prime minister? In Jamaica. Yaman.
Dan Donovan.
Stuff up.
You're incredible. What a fantastic start to the year. I really appreciate chatting with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.
We could go on forever,
Happy
and we're
New
gonna
Year.
have to. We could go on forever. We're gonna have to check back in with you in a little bit. Really appreciate it. We're going to
let's
take
talk about after the Rouleau Commission. I'm very interested to talk to you because I'm curious to see how it's going to come out.
We're gonna be back in 2 minutes with some concluding comments. Stay with us, everybody.